this is an iHeart podcast. Guaranteed human.
You know how it's never really about where you're going, it's about who you're going with? The right people can turn any drive into a great memory. That's something Toyota really believes. They design vehicles around real life and real people, the ones who make plans happen and bring everyone together. Inside, everything's built with passengers in mind. Comfortable seating, smart layouts, and space that actually works so everyone can relax and enjoy the ride. There's room for the people, room for the stuff, and room for the moments that happen along the way. Because when people are the destination, your ride is important. Learn more at Toyota.com and find the vehicle that fits your people.
Lowe's knows Sundays are for football. So tackle your home improvement projects by Saturday and earn your Sunday with great deals on LG and Bosch appliances, select Bounty and Swiffer cleaning products, and more. Then once your to-do list is done, get ready to kick back, relax, and enjoy the game. Shop in-store or online now and earn your Sunday with help from Lowe's, official partner of the NFL.
This is the Late Round Podcast with your host, JJ Zacharisa.
Hey guys, no, this is not your typical Late Round Podcast. Every once in a while during the offseason, I'll bring back an evergreen episode from the past that's still relevant today. I'm doing that here because it's a holiday weekend, it's May, and there's a lot of stuff going on behind the scenes that I need to put some energy into. More on that coming very, very soon. But today, I'm going to throw some research at you that I did last year on middle round running backs and their pass catching ability. Specifically, spotting middle round running back value by simply looking at previous season yards per route run. You'll hear the study on today's Rewind episode, and you'll also hear some names from last year who fit the criteria of being red flags within that statistic. Not all of them completely flamed out, like Ramondre Stevenson, who had a resurgence at the end of the season after kind of a mediocre start. But there were a lot of hits with this method. Chuba Hubbard, Jordan Mason, Tony Pollard, Tyrone Tracy, they all weren't that special. In my opinion, it's a really interesting way to look at these middle round running backs. And since I know I'm going to get questions about it, I'll talk very briefly about running backs who fit this criteria at the end of the show. But first, give the episode A New Way to Spot Middle Round Running Back Breakouts a quick listen. I've always been fascinated with average draft position data. Like, we can always do analysis and see the types of traits that certain league-winning wide receivers or running backs share, and sort of do our analysis from there. Like, if we know league-winning running backs always come from good offenses, then we should probably focus on running backs in good offenses. If we knew that league-winning wide receivers never had a teammate drafted in the top 24 at the position, then we'd probably focus on wideouts who had a lot of projected target share for themselves. That kind of stuff. But not all of that is always actionable. If the market is factoring in a lot of the discoveries that we make from that type of analysis, it's not bad to have that information in mind, but it's not as useful as we think, because a player's cost will already reflect all of those things. Like, if we went to a farmer's market, you might find a fruit vendor that does a ton of business each week. They've got really good fruit, objectively. But it also costs a lot to get that fruit. So the cost benefit actually might not be there. Wouldn't you want to find the smaller fruit vendor who has better prices and may be able to offer up similar tasting fruit? That's why I look so much through the lens of ADP, because it's one way to ensure that we're finding value throughout our draft. Now, through the years, something that's always been obvious when doing my ADP analysis is that pass-catching running backs will outperform expectation at a severely higher rate than the alternative. Like, somehow the market still doesn't factor in pass-catching enough at running back. But it's one thing to say, hey, draft running backs who catch passes. It's another to actually tell you what to look for when you're doing that. And I realized that mistake when writing this year's late round draft guide, which, by the way, the guide will be out on July 1st. Make sure you're pre-ordering right now. But I'm bringing up the draft guide because a big focus of that guide for me this year has centered around making things even more actionable for the reader. Like, I can say, hey, running backs who are league winners, they usually look like X, when that X is some piece of information that we learn after the season. Going back to the quick example I shared earlier, running backs are league winners when they're in offenses that scored 3 or more touchdowns per game. Okay, let's say that's true. Let's say that's factual. Now tell me which offenses will score 3 or more touchdowns per game. When it comes to receiving work, tell me which running backs are going to catch a lot of passes this year. Now, we can have a general idea of who will and who won't catch passes. Rachaad White, remember his second year in the league? That was a big draft guide hit that year, largely because his receiving upside was there. We knew that he had a shot to play that kind of pass catching role. And we knew that he had a collegiate profile that really dictated that. But it was still a more subjective take. Now, rather than looking at that through some semi-subjective lens, I took things a step further this year to show you that one metric might be more predictive versus the market than you probably think at running back. And that metric is yards per route run. We've been working with yards per route run at wide receiver for years now. And while myself and other analysts will cite yards per route run at running back, I'm not sure we're citing it enough. Though to be fair, I'm not really listening to other fantasy podcasts, so maybe I'm wrong. In the draft guide this year, I break the running back position down into 3 buckets: early round players, middle round running backs, and then late round running backs. I split things up because each part of your draft actually dictates that you think about the position a little bit differently versus how the market has historically behaved. There are some interesting pass catching trends with early round running backs, but I'll save that for another day. What I really want to get to today is the middle round area, which is defined as running backs ranked as RB19 to RB42. Now, there are reasons for those boundaries that I discuss in the guide, but that's also not that important of a topic for today's show. Just know that I've defined middle round running backs as the ones who are ranked 19th to 42nd by average draft position. Since 2014, which is where my ADP data goes back to, and shout out fantasy data for that data, but since 2014, there have been 233 middle round running backs who played at least 8 games in their analyzed season. So minimum 8 games played and had an ADP of RB19 to RB42. 59 of those 233 middle round running backs finished their season with a sub 5% target share per game rate. 104 of them were in the 5% to 10% range. And then 70 of those running backs had a 10% target share per game rate or better. Now get this, of the players with a sub 5% target share, only 1.7% of them outperformed their average draft position expectation by 2 or more PPR points per game. Now, average draft position expectation, it's exactly as it sounds. It's the number of points we'd expect a player to score at a certain ADP. That's all based on historical data. So if that player's actual points per game exceeded his expected points per game by 2 or more points, he'd be in that 1.7% bucket. But 1.7% is an insanely small number. For the backs who had target shares between 5% and 10%, that number jumps up to 21%. 21% of those players outperform ADP expectation by 2 or more points per game. For the guys with target shares above 10%, the rate of outperforming expectation by 2 or more points per game is 43%. And when you talk about ceiling, forget about the guys who don't catch passes. When looking at middle round running backs who exceed expectation by 6 or more points per game, which are like the true league winning players from the middle rounds, none of them out of the 59 with sub 5% target shares got there. Meanwhile, just 2% of the 104 running backs with a 5 to 10% target share per game rate, just 2% of them got there. But then almost 16% of the backs who had a 10% target share per game rate or better were able to outperform expectation by 6 or more PPR points per game. Look, middle round running backs have this really wide range of possible target share outcomes. There are so many archetypes of running backs in that area of your draft, and that makes for a larger discrepancy in outcome when it comes to target share. So the clear trend here is that you basically only want to target pass catchers in the middle rounds of your draft. But again, saying that is one thing. Actually having a tool to find it is another. Now you can look at previous season target share to get a decent idea, but that's a bigger and better idea for early round running backs. Why? Because early round running backs generally have a season under their belt. That's why they're being drafted in the early rounds. With middle round guys, you'll have players who were like part-time players the year prior, and they're being drafted as an RB3 because maybe they showed us something. Or maybe they're in an ambiguous backfield where the backfield appears split. The middle rounds are full of running backs who are unknowns, while the early rounds, they're not. That's basically what I'm getting at here, and why simply looking at how previous season target share is correlated to outperforming expectation in the early rounds is more impactful than the middle rounds. In the middle rounds, you're better off looking at previous season yards per route run. Now, going back to our sample of 233 middle round running backs, 167 of them were coming off seasons where they had run 100 or more routes. And shout out PFF for the routes run data. So essentially, we're starting with 233 running backs, but then we're removing a chunk of them because they either didn't get enough run as a receiver in the previous season or they were rookies. I then grouped those 167 backs into 4 buckets. You could think of them as Tier A, Tier B, Tier C, and Tier D, and yards per route run. And that's previous season yards per route run. Tier A is the best group, Tier B is the second best, and so on. Now, Tier A is designated by running backs who hit a 1.7 yards per route run rate in their previous season or above. It's arbitrary, but it gives us a decent enough sample to work with. 25 running backs did that after hitting 100 routes run in their previous season. Tier B is 1.2 to 1.7 yards per route run. Tier C is 0.7 to 1.2. And then Tier D, the worst group, is less than 0.7 yards per route run in that N-1 season, or the previous season. Tier B has 52 running backs in it, Tier C has 64, and Tier D has 26. So we have 4 groups that are formed by previous season yards per route run. Now get this, of the 26 running backs who had a sub 0.7 yards per route run rate in their N-1 season, that previous season, just 8% of them exceeded ADP expectation the following year by 2 or more PPR points per game. Every other group was at least 24%, so 3 times the rate of Tier D. Meanwhile, not a single one of the 26 running backs from Tier D exceeded expectation by 6 or more points per game. Not a single one of them had a monstrously high ceiling. Now, on the flip side, the best upside rates, they come from Tier A. 24% of them exceeded expectation by 4 or more PPR points per game. That's 7 percentage points better than any other group. 12% of them outperform expectation by 6 or more PPR points per game. That's nearly double any other group. To put this another way, previous season yards per route run can at least directionally get us closer to hitting on running backs in the middle rounds. And for the record, this all comes down to target share. Since 2014, we haven't seen a single Tier D running back get to a 10% target share per game rate, meaning they have some sort of yards per route run rate below 0.7 in one season. And then the following season, they fail to reach a 10% target share. And as we just discussed, a 10% target share means a lot out of the middle rounds. Now, of course, a lot of those players just didn't have high target shares in the previous season to begin with. And previous season target share, that can be helpful too. It's just that statistically, yards per route run for middle round running backs is more helpful. And not only that, but this is not just for the extremes. This is not just looking at players who had really low yards per route run rates or players who had really high ones. Even guys who had 0.7 to 1.2 yards per route run rates, they only hit a 10% target share the following season at about a 19% rate. There were 19 of those Tier C players who had target shares of 10% or better in their N-1 season, their previous season. So they hit a 10% target share per game rate in one year, they ran 100 plus routes that year, and they had a yards per route run rate of 0.7 to 1.2. Then they played 8 games the following year. Of those 19 with pretty low yards per route run rates and a 10% target share, only 5 of them had a target share per game rate above 10% the following year. You would think something like that might be a little bit stickier, but it's not as sticky when the back is ineffective per route run. And just to be totally clear, yards per route run is something that you can look at across all rounds of your draft. It just seems to be the most meaningful when things are most up in the air, which is the middle rounds. Like I said, in the early rounds, most players will have a high target share projection. In the late rounds, most players are just going to kind of suck for fantasy purposes. In the middle rounds, you get a wide variety of usable players. And this all works in both directions. If a player had a low yards per route run rate, then he has a better chance to not see an uptick in target share the following year. If it's high though, then he's going to have better odds of getting to that 10% target share mark. And then these players are going to have better or worse odds at exceeding ADP expectation as well, which is the most important thing. Now, the obvious question based on all this information is who should we be targeting and who should we be avoiding in 2025? And I want to say, none of this is foolproof. You shouldn't just take one metric and full on fade a player based on one metric. This is all about probability and improving our probability of hitting on some of these players. But funny enough, the main middle round running back this year who had a sweet yards per route run rate last year was David Montgomery. Now, there are many reasons why his situation is just simply unique. So I don't know if this is super actionable for him, but it's still interesting. But there's also Austin Eckler. ADP sources may not have him quite in the middle round range, but he's at least around it. And regardless of where you are in your draft, like I've been saying, yards per route run does seem to matter to some degree. He was literally at 1.694 last year. He was 0.001 yards away from hitting our relatively arbitrary 1.7 threshold. Now, I mentioned Eckler on becoming a best ball bro, but the gap between him and Brian Robinson, in my opinion, shouldn't be nearly as wide as it is. Now, on the other end of things, there are three backs to call out. Jordan Mason is one of them. He had a 0.54 yards per route run rate last year. And remember, players below that 0.7 mark have not hit a 10% target share the following season since at least 2014. But it's Jordan Mason, then it's Ramondre Stevenson, who likely won't get there now with Travion Henderson in New England. And then there's one surprising player. It's Chuba Hubbard. Now, Hubbard technically is like on the fringe of being an early round pick versus a middle round one. But to reiterate, it's not like these trends cease to exist when you hit RB19. It's just that we gradually can shift our focus to different things. Hubbard has never been a beast in yards per route run. He actually had just a 0.79 yards per route run rate in 2023. That led the following year to almost a 12% target share per game rate. So he wasn't a tier D running back, but he wasn't far off. But I'm probably going to be more bearish than bullish in 2025. We rarely see, in fact, we haven't seen since 2014, a running back with this low of a previous season yards per route run rate see a high target share the following season. And they haven't given us any league-winning seasons either. And look at what the Panthers did this offseason. They added Rico Dowdle, he can play a pass-catching role, and they drafted Trevor Etienne, who's a pass-catching back. There's definitely a scenario here where Chuba Hubbard isn't used quite as much as a pass catcher here in 2025. And if that happens, that's not good news for his ability to outperform cost. There are some others who are more fringe, and I break things down more in the draft guide, but those are the big ones to watch out with this research. Now look, it's not that yards per route run is this perfect running back stat. It's not. We see research done all the time on which stats correlate to next season's success. And that research is obviously really helpful to this game that we all love. And running back yards per route run, it probably won't rank very high on that list of metrics to focus on. But what's missing from that analysis is what's actually being captured and what isn't being captured by the market. Some statistics like touchdown rate at quarterback, some stats see really poor correlation year over year. We shouldn't be drafting players based on previous season touchdown rate. But because the market actually seems to do that, then we can lean into it too, because we know how to spot values then. That's what I talked about a couple of weeks ago on that touchdown rate episode. We're doing the same thing here, except we're targeting the statistic. Because to this day, gamers are just still undervaluing pass catching at running back. And this is one way to increase your odds in hitting on that league-winning pass catching back. Okay, now that you heard all that, you're undoubtedly wondering which running backs have red flags associated with their profiles this year here in 2026, and maybe which ones have green flags. Looking at Fantasy Pros' current ADP, I'll look specifically at RB19 to RB42. Again, middle round running backs. There really aren't that many elite yards per route run profiles in the middle rounds this year, but the best one out there belongs to Jaylen Warren, who was at 1.58 last year according to PFF data. Kenneth Gainwell's is pretty close to that, but Bucky Irving, currently RB19, his was pretty much the exact same, and they're obviously in the same backfield this year. So on the good side, Jaylen Warren does stand out at least a little bit. I don't think that alone makes him a great value or a target, but it certainly gives him a little bit of a boost. Now on the bad side, there's a lot to get through. Javonte Williams technically isn't in that middle round bucket this year because he's the RB18. But I do think his .40 yards per route run from last year is worrisome. Fortunately for him, that depth chart looks really bad behind him. So it may not totally impact him. It's not like Chuba Hubbard last year where we had a pretty decent back in Rico Dowdle backing him up. Some of you will probably want me to point out Bashal Tutin, who is at .9 in yards per route run. But Tutin didn't run 100 routes last year. His data point really isn't that reliable. Chris Rodriguez, his top competition, who's also a middle round pick technically, he didn't get there either. And his yards per route run was pretty miserable at .34, albeit in a different situation. Now technically Blake Corum and J.K. Dobbins fall into this category, with really low yards per route run rates of .31 and .32. But they barely were over that 100 route mark. We once again had Jordan Mason, who had a .32 yards per route run rate last year. He's just not a pass catcher. He's never been a great pass catcher. I wouldn't expect that to change here in 2026. Now, something kind of interesting on this list, Rachaad White, who's now in Washington. He had his worst yards per route run rate of his career last year at .72 on over 300 routes run. Bucky Irving was significantly better in the same offense. Now White's in Washington, and Ja'Cory Krosky-Merritt, his yards per route run was also miserable last year at .49 on 140 routes. So there's not obvious competition to take some of those looks from Rachaad White. And I'm definitely concerned about Krosky-Merritt. Now, another player to call out, Kyle Monangai. I think Monangai's in that like Blake Corum bucket, as I said on the late round show, where I like him and I like Corum in best ball, where we don't have to choose when those big weeks are going to happen, and then they have that injury upside. But I think for both of those guys without an injury, we probably won't see huge receiving numbers. Tony Pollard is an even bigger red flag this year than he was last year. His yards per route run was .68 last year. That was the worst of his career, so I'm pretty nervous about him in 2026. And then the final call out, Travion Henderson. 238 routes run, .93 yards per route run. That's not sound the alarms territory, but we'd rather have a little bit higher of a number. So if I were to sum up the negative side, the red flag side, I'd say Blake Corum and Kyle Monangai, they both look like split backfield running backs who won't see a big uptick in receiving work. But with their current contingent upside, they're still not bad picks in best ball. Just not as much in your managed league. Ja'Cory Krosky-Merritt didn't have a super well-rounded receiving profile as a prospect, and it didn't translate in year one. So that's a problem. Jordan Mason continues to be someone who doesn't fit my process very well, similar to last year. And then Tony Pollard, I just don't think he's a high upside selection. And yeah, I think this data does point to us pumping the brakes a little bit, assuming there's going to be some massive change in New England. There's more bad than good here because we're talking about lower tiered running backs, lower tiered starters. But if we approach these profiles with the right kind of caution, it can give us a little bit of an edge. That's it for today's show, though. Thanks to all of you for listening. If you yet subscribed to the Late Round Fantasy Football Podcast, make sure you are by searching for it pretty much anywhere podcasts can be found. And don't forget to follow me on Twitter and on Blue Sky at Late Round QB. Thanks for listening, everyone. I'll be back with the Late Round show on Wednesday at noon Eastern on YouTube, and then it's a mailbag week, so I'll talk to you with that on Friday. Take care.
You know how it's never really about where you're going, it's about who you're going with? The right people can turn any drive into a great memory. That's something Toyota really believes. They design vehicles around real life and real people, the ones who make plans happen and bring everyone together. Inside, everything's built with passengers in mind. Comfortable seating, smart layouts, and space that actually works so everyone can relax and enjoy the ride. There's room for the people, room for the stuff, and room for the moments that happen along the way. Because when people are the destination, your ride is important. Learn more at Toyota.com and find the vehicle that fits your people.
Paramount Plus is now the home of all your BET favorites.
What? Yes!
With all new episodes of Tyler Perry's Divorce Sisters.
You've always liked a little drama.
Plus a whole new world of movies like Gladiator 2.
Now I will control an empire.
Original series like The Chi.
Just make sure we protect each other.
And live sports like UFC.
Welcome to the history books!
New home, same family. Your BET favorites are now on Paramount Plus. Subscribe now.
This is an iHeart podcast. Guaranteed Human.